Hello, AP Psychology. We are going to continue looking at seminal studies in psychology research and particularly focusing on a few studies that would be considered to be questionable ethically by today's standards. I have a couple of pictures here. This study is from John Watson, and John Watson did a lot of work with babies without the consent of their parents. That, of course, would be considered unethical today. Over here is a well-known psychologist named Harry Harlow, and he worked with primates. He was particularly interested in attachment. His work would also probably not be allowed under today's animal ethics standards. The first study we're going to look at today is the Stanford Prison Experiment. This was done in 1971 at Stanford University by Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist that I had introduced to you previously. What this really demonstrated for us was the power of the situation. Now I'm going to show you a video clip from this study, and then we'll talk about what it showed us about the power of the situation.
Let's consider the strange case of the Stanford University jail, which once stood here in the basement of the psychology building. It was part of an unusual experiment on the psychology of imprisonment that my colleagues Craig Haney, Kurt Banks, Carlo Prescott, and I conducted in the early 70s. We wanted to see just what happens when you put good people in a bad situation. In this case, in jail. Each of the students who volunteered for our study was carefully tested. Each had to be psychologically and physically healthy to participate. A small group of students was then randomly selected to act as prisoners, while others became guards. We surprised the prisoners by having them arrested at their homes and dormitories. At the jail, uniforms and status symbols, rules, and other details helped distinguish between the two groups, which were indistinguishable at the start. The prisoners underwent a series of rituals to establish their new lowly status. They lived in tiny cells. They spent 24 hours a day here, cut off from their usual surroundings.
What is happening to prisoner 819? Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Let's give her 5 times to make sure you remember it. Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Down. Up. Down.
The guards, however, only worked 8-hour shifts and returned to their normal routines as students when off the job.
Up. 5 or 8 6 are belly rolls. These are push-ups. Keep that back straight. Down.
What happened surprised everyone, including me. The illusion became the reality. The boundary between the role each person was playing and his real personal identity was erased.
Mr. Correctional Officer. Keep it straight.
Nice boys became brutal guards. Healthy kids got sick.
Get in that box there.
Active ones became passive and zombie-like prisoners.
This is unbelievable. They took their clothes.
Hands off the door.
They took our bed.
Hands off the door. Where's your
The situation became so overpowering that many of the prisoners developed extreme stress reactions and had to be released. But no one ever said, "I quit the experiment." They had lost all perspective.
You come over there. You should act it out. You be the bride of Frankenstein, and you be Frankenstein. I want you to walk over here like Frankenstein and say that you love 296.
What kind of guard would you be? Sadistic or supportive? Would you be a conforming prisoner or a heroic resistor? The prison study, like Milgram's experiment, is not typical of research in social psychology. Some psychologists feel both studies violated ethical guidelines and should never have been done.
Push up. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now you go in there and tell 546 that you love it. I love you. Ain't that sweet? Ain't that sweet?
At times, even I forgot I was an experimenter and acted like a prison warden. And so we were forced to call off what was planned as a 2-week experiment after only 6 days. How could such basically good people have done such terrible things? It's because we all have the capacity for evil and good, waiting for the right or wrong situation to bring it out. And when the situation ends, we return to our old selves again. Extensive follow-ups that over many years failed to reveal any negative long-term effects on the subjects in the prison study. If anything, many subjects said it was a positive learning experience. They had seen a side of themselves they had never thought possible.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a role, a job, saying your job is to keep these people in line, then you're certainly not the same person as if you were in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part. That's your costume, and you have to act accordingly when you put it on.
It still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It's just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state. I began to feel that identity, that the person that I was that had decided to go to prison was distant from me, was remote, until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number, and 416 was going to have to decide what to do. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. I've read about it. I've read a lot about it, but I've never experienced it firsthand. I've never seen someone turn that way. And I know you're a nice guy. You know? You understand? I do. I do know you're a nice guy. I don't get that because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do. If you say, oh, well, I'm not going to hurt anybody. Oh, well, it's a limited situation. It's over in 2 weeks.
Well, you in position, what would you have done?
I don't know.
Experiments.
So, in this study, what was really striking was how quickly people took on the role of either guard or prisoner. The prisoners were actually stripped. They were allowed only this frock. They had no undergarments. They were in the jail 24/7. Now, at first I thought it was kind of fun and they were all kind of just playing along. And after just a couple of days, things seemed to be very real to them. They took on the role that they were assigned in this situation, which was completely arbitrary, but nevertheless they took on that role. There were a few guards in particular, one that they called John Wayne, who decided, you can hear in other interviews of him, that he decided that he was going to carry out his own little experiments. He was going to see how far he could go in getting the prisoners to go along with him. Now, their instructions were that they were not to harm anyone physically, but they could use whatever psychological manipulation they wanted to with the prisoners. So this included things like making a prisoner sit in a closet all night long because he didn't eat a sausage, or taking away their mattresses. And in reality, many of the guards actually became quite brutal very quickly, and the prisoners also acted very institutionalized, not really realizing that this was just a simulation. They could have left it. And in fact, it was Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, who later became his wife, who said, "Phil, you gotta stop this experiment." And that's why it stopped after only 6 days instead of the 2 weeks that were originally planned. Now, what this research study illustrated for us is something called the fundamental attribution error. When people commit psychological tyranny, so to speak, like these guards did against the prisoners, our inclination is to say, well, he must have just been a bad apple. He's just a bad guy. And in reality, it was the situation that brought that out in him. So what the fundamental attribution error is then, and this is an important term in social psychology, is that we overestimate the effect of disposition and underestimate the effect of situation in explaining the behavior of others. So we look at this guy and he said, well, he's just a sadist. He just must be a sadistic guy at his core. If we were that guard, however, we would say, well, you know, it was really something about the situation that brought that out in us, and that's why we acted that way. So this was an important study that did show us the powerful effect of social roles and the fundamental attribution error, but it did cause a great deal of distress among the people who participated in it. And as Phil would even say himself, this type of study would not be allowed under current day ethical guidelines. Now, the Asch effect was another study that looked at a social psych phenomenon, and this one was conformity. Now, Solomon Asch was a immigrant from Germany. He was Jewish and was well aware of the atrocities that occurred in Germany. Many social psychologists in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s really wanted to try to understand how did this whole Nazism, Holocaust experience occur? How did people end up following someone who was clearly had, you know, really evil intent? Conformity was one of the things that Solomon Asch was interested in. So in 1951, he devised a series of tests, and there would be confederates of the researcher, and I've already defined confederates as someone who is working with a researcher, and they were given a series of lines to look at. So there would be confederates, and then there would be the subjects. The question is basically, here's a sample line. Now raise your hand when I point to the line that is the same length as the sample line. So most of us would clearly say that it is line C. However, in the 12 trials, at least 75% gave at least one incorrect answer when the confederates also gave the incorrect answer. So for example, if the confederates raised their hand at line B, the subject would look around the room and say, either I'm really uncomfortable, I don't know if I can go against the group, or the other thing that they thought is maybe there's something wrong with me and my perception. So they went along for one reason or another. Now, Asch did several experiments, and we know that numerous variables affect conformity, including whether or not there was another legitimate confederate, or not confederate, but subject in the room who would clearly see that line B was not the same as the sample line. And so they together, when you have, you know, like in a group, when you have someone else who's willing to not conform with you, then you are more likely not to conform. So that was basically the conclusion of Asch's experiment. Now, the next study we're going to look at, I'm going to continue on a different screencast, and it has to do with specifically trying to understand the powers or the processes behind the Holocaust. And so I will talk about that on the next screencast.